nothing but the truth.
Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa of India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. This is my weekly X-ray of key issues that matter to you without holding back on the truth. Let's dive into a storm that is shaking India's economy, not the tragic floods caused by excessive rainfall that has caused havoc across the country, but something just as devastating. Donald Trump's tariff blitz saw the US president put India in the highest bracket of trade penalties of 50%. That came into effect from August 27th onwards and has already begun to adversely impact businesses across India in a range of key sectors. So in this episode of Nothing But the Truth, we will look at not only the pain points and challenges that this new threat poses, but also the opportunities it throws up for Indian entrepreneurs to find new export markets. But let's begin with the human face of tariffs. Let me talk about Tony Uppal, who owns 5 apparel factories in Faridabad, employs over 7,000 workers, and he was doing a flourishing business till recently. Last year, for instance, he exported goods worth rupees 750 crore to the US. 750 crore. But Trump's heavy tariffs of 50% on apparels being exported from India is likely to spell doom for him. It is a breaking point for our businesses, Tony Uppal told India Today. And remember that Tony Uppal exports garments exclusively to the United States and says that the steep rise in tariffs will ensure that the American consumer has to pay 30% more for Indian garments as compared to those being imported from, say, Bangladesh and Vietnam. Now, American brands are unlikely to absorb the added cost and will simply shift sourcing elsewhere, which means that Indian companies will be done in. And as Tony Uppal says, if we absorb the 30% cost differential, we will be bankrupt in 3 months. That's what Tony Uppal says. And his business operates on a thin margin of 5 to 6%. And therefore, if he gets 50% on him, that will destroy his entire business. And he says if things do not change soon, the first thing he will have to do is to reduce his headcount. And beyond that, Tony Uppal says that he even may have to shut down within the month. That's how serious it is, which means if he shuts down his factory, it will result in a really massive layoff of 7,000 employees. Remember, Tony Uppal is just one of the factories that I'm talking about, and he is not alone in his distress. Much of the textile industry, which employs 45 million people in India, is going to be impacted. In fact, India exports $10.8 billion worth of textiles and garments to the US, which accounts for 1/3 of the sector's total. So you can imagine how serious that dent is going to be, with US exports accounting for a large portion of our textile sector's exports. But the textile sector, unfortunately, is not alone in the woes they are suffering from high US tariffs that have just come in. From engineering goods, particularly manufacturers in Mumbai, to diamond exporters in Surat, exporters of leather goods in Kolkata, and a host of others, all of them are experiencing a sudden flood that is likely to wipe out all their earnings. So, how did Indian exporters come to such a sorry pass? As mentioned, on August 27th, the US imposed an additional 25% cess on Indian goods, claiming, as Trump says, as a punishment for buying Russian oil. This came on top of a 25% reciprocal tariff earlier in the month, and together, that's a 50% levy, and it catapulted Indian exports into the world's highest tariff bracket. Now, just see how unfair Trump's tariffs and these are evident from the following facts. China, for instance, the largest buyer of Russian oil, faces only 30% tariff for its goods it exports to the US. India's trade rivals like Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia have only 19% tariff on them. Vietnam and Bangladesh, 20%. US allies like Japan and the EU are just 15%. All this, mind you, compared to the 50% that India has to pay despite India-US relations supposedly being very positive before all this happened. We were seen as strategic partners, and now Donald Trump has done this to what he calls his best friend, which is Prime Minister Modi. That doesn't seem to show up in his actions. So the result is, in one stroke, Indian products became significantly more expensive than almost every other competitor in the world. Now let's look at what's the scale of the shock that these tariffs have caused. India sends nearly 20% or a fifth of its total exports to the US. That is $86.5 billion worth. Trade bodies estimate Trump's tariffs will hurt around 55% of that, or $47 billion in export value. And the remaining 45%, if you recall, Trump has so far not put heavy levies on things like pharmaceuticals because America needs them and it comes cheap. And if he puts that there, the day-to-day life of people in America would be impacted. So pharmaceuticals are out for the moment, along with other electronic goods, which would hurt American industries if he raises the tariff. So he's been very selective, but remember, he's hit almost half of our total exports that we do to the US, and some say it could be as high as 66%. Now, economists warn that India's GDP growth could take a hit of 0.5% to 1% in the coming financial year. Now, that is significant. It might look like 0.5 or just 1%, but that's a hell of a lot of not just money in terms of billions of dollars, but also of jobs that could be lost. And remember that these aren't just numbers. They translate to layoffs, as we talked about in the Faridabad garment factory just now. There could be shutdowns and livelihoods at a risk for millions of families. Now, just a bit, I talked about the garment sector, and let me tell you about some of the other key sectors that are going to be impacted. Let's start with engineering goods. Now, engineering goods form the biggest slice of India's exports to the US, accounting for close to $20 billion worth annually. Now, India's Today magazine spoke to the brothers Pankaj and Manoj Chadda, who run Jyoti Steel Industries in Mumbai, and they make specialized steel and have a turnover of 800 crore rupees, and they do expect a lot of losses coming in from what the US tariffs have done. The Chadda brothers told us that they are dependent of, say, close to 20% of their business, 10 to 20% of their business for exports in the US. They make this very special kind of steel. And they estimate that almost rupees 50 crore they would lose overnight. And the reasons are that rivals from Southeast Asia with lower tariffs will suddenly look cheaper, as we would mention in the garment sector. And there is a practical problem that the Chadda brothers face. They say that America or the US uses the old metric system, and Indian entrepreneurs or enterprises like the Chadda brothers have invested in tools designed for the American market. Switching to new markets isn't as simple as just redirecting a shipment, and they would have to again make the dies and everything else. Of course, let's also remember it's not easy to penetrate markets because there's a lot of trust that needs to be built, and that takes time. So overall, in the short term, India's engineering sector is likely to lose as much as $6 billion, and 1.5 million jobs are threatened. Remember that. Apart from the fact of revenue loss, there's going to be a huge loss in terms of jobs if the tariffs continue, and that is a threat that this sector faces, as do the others. And let me tell you about another sector that is going to be impacted by high US tariffs, and this is the gems and jewelry sector. Now, the US is India's single largest market for cut and polished stones, including diamonds. And out of the $16 billion in exports, $10 billion went to America in the last financial year. And if you remember, the famed diamond belt of Gujarat employs around 800,000 people, or 8 lakh people. These are cutters and polishers. And this sector is staring at a potential collapse. We spoke to exporters like Vijay Mangukia, who built a 60 crore rupee business, And he says that he expects half of his turnover to vanish, which means that because he's heavily dependent on the US market, where he's actually set up 2 offices in Texas and New York, he would have no options but to shut shop and lay off his employees. That's how serious it is. And meanwhile, his rivals and the gem sector's rivals, Indian gems and jewelry sector rivals in Turkey, with just 15% tariffs, are circling in and capturing the business. I'll talk of 2 other big sectors, seafood and leather, which are also severely hit. Seafood exports, for instance, are worth $2.8 billion, and they face effective tariffs of 60%. That puts 20 million Indian fishermen at risk. That's how bad it is, particularly off the coast of Andhra, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, these coastal, and of course Maharashtra. These coastal towns have had huge shrimp businesses and other kinds of marine products are now going to be badly hit by the Trump's tariffs. And as I had mentioned, it's more than 50%. It goes up to 60% in their cases. Take a look at the leather industry. Again, this is, in terms of employment, one of the largest industries in India because of the fact of its high labor content that is needed. And this sector, too, is hurting badly. America accounts for over 20% of India's leather exports. And one of the leading exporters, Mohammed Azhar of Crescent Exports in Kolkata, is at the heart of India's leather export crisis that is unfolding. Now, Azhar has a turnover of rupees 100 crore and employs close to 1,500 workers. He tells us, he told India Today, that nearly 40% of his shipments are bound for America, meaning orders worth rupees 26 crore are halted at the production stage because of the tariffs. For Azhar, the problem is compounded by the fact that the US absorbs bulk consignments and drives fashion trends that can't be moved elsewhere to other countries. So he's stuck, and he says exploring new markets is not a viable alternative at the moment. And he says the US can buy in scale, others cannot, and American fashion does not work everywhere. So Azhar fears that if this standoff persists between India and the US, he might have to let go as many as 400 of his employees in the first stage and much more as things in case there is no settlement reached between India and the US. Now let's look at what the Modi government can do to, in some senses, alleviate the situation, and what do Indian entrepreneurs also need to do apart from trying to rely on the government to bail them out. Let's be clear, the most vulnerable are the micro, small, and medium enterprises. In engineering goods alone, out of the 6,300 firms, 5,000 depend on the US for 20% of their businesses. So we talked to a range of experts on this, and they recommend that in the short term, we spoke, for instance, to the Engineering Export Promotion Council, and they say there are only 2 ways to stay competitive: slash prices or extend payment terms. Now, both of these need government backing. So exporters, Indian exporters, want cheaper loans through extended interest subvention schemes and are looking to the Modi government to make such concessions. But as Anil Bharadwaj of the Federation of Indian MSMEs, or micro, small, and medium enterprises, points out to us that if the cost difference is 25 to 30%, then interest subvention alone, which the exporters are asking the government to do, will not save them. Experts say that the medium-term strategy should be to push for diversification of exporting countries, not to just focus on the US alone, but look elsewhere that could pick up their goods. And for that, they need help to break into new markets, whether it's in the ASEAN countries, whether it's Japan, the EU, the UK, Australia, Latin America, West Asia, and most importantly, Africa. These are countries that remain unexplored in terms of volumes for Indian exporters. And they say that this is the thrust that Indian exporters who are stuck because of the US high tariffs, they should start looking at that seriously and work out how they could do business with that. And these exporters say they want funds from both the Modi government at the center and state governments concerned to help them break into new markets. But also, let's be clear, breaking in will take time. So in the short term, as they said, they would require not only to cut their own prices, but also to expect the government to come up with some sort of credit subvention schemes or other kinds of relief. The GST coming in will certainly spur Indian consumption, and the fact it'll bring down prices in India, and that might also help, but in an indirect way. They're not banking on that, but that's a good move that the government has done. And the fact that the latest figures show that the Indian economy is growing rapidly, and some of that had so far not been stalled by the American tariffs. And overall, the experts say that maybe we could begin to weather it, but we have to be very, very careful. And certainly the government has to step in to help these exporters in whatever way they can. We are told by the government that they're working out on some measures in terms of relief. The sooner they do it, the better for these exporters. Let's also finally look at what to do in terms of long-term reforms. We spoke to Naushad Forbes, who's co-chairman of a leading engineering firm, and he argues that India's chance to fix structural issues such as making land available cheap for businesses, amending the stifling labor laws and compliance rules, and also for providing quality infrastructure. This would make Indian companies more competitive. The argument is that the crisis requires solution, and people across the country would be more amenable to tough reforms that they earlier resisted if they realize that the options are, in many senses, closing in, and they need to act fast. And therefore, some of these things, whether it's land, labor, infrastructure, needed to be speeded up so that we become more competitive, our companies become more competitive. Of course, economists like Ajit Ranade argues that it's worth being patient as well, not to get too much into panic, because tariffs, after all, are paid upfront by importers and eventually by US consumers, American consumers. And studies suggest that 80% of the burden will be borne in America. And so the expectation is that at some point, this will become highly unpopular within America because the American people will have to pay higher prices for the goods that they import. And many of them actually believe in Indian goods because they come with the price as well as the quality that they want, and some of them are really niche products. So they will continue to consume it, but be quite upset by the fact that these prices have gone up, and they will then put pressure on President Trump to start having a deal with India, because inflation for America is something that Trump had promised that he would keep low. But if that goes awry, then India has a chance of striking a deal. But so far, let's be very clear, the president remains belligerent. He is very upset with what has happened at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting at Tianjin, China recently, and has been making very snide remarks about India's participation in that. But this could be negotiating tactics, and India needs to keep its cool and continue to do business with America while looking for other options. So the big message to Indian entrepreneurs is don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't depend on a single market, no matter how lucrative it is. At the same time, don't abandon it. America remains the world's largest consumer market. The best outcome would be to restore normal trade relations, which I mentioned earlier. And if you take a look at history, it shows India's strength lies in its adaptability and resilience. The tariff shock is another test for India. If it forces our country to improve productivity, invest in quality, and seek new markets, it may well become a catalyst for reform and renewal. So there is opportunity in these challenges. In the end, let's be clear, this isn't just a story about tariffs. It's about entrepreneurs like Tony Uppal in Faridabad, who's under great stress, the Chadha brothers in Mumbai and their steel factory, Mohammad Azhar in Kolkata making leather that could soon shut down, Mangu Kia in Surat and the diamond market that is there, that is on the verge of collapse, and let's not forget millions and millions of anonymous workers stitching clothes, cutting diamonds, and polishing leather. They are in deep trouble and they need to be noticed. And therefore, India Today, in its latest issue, has put out an in-depth report called The Victims of Trump Tariffs. And this is worth reading. It's done by my colleagues, headed by M.G. Arun, our managing editor. You can also listen to my podcast on Apple and Spotify. The same program is put on that in case you'd like to just do an audio. Thank you for being with me on this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I'll look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing but the truth.